Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, 30-year architect, member of the American Institute of Architects, and founder of the nonprofit organization Architects and Engineers for 911Truth. I'm joined by my colleague Barbara Honegger, board member of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, former White House official and Department of Defense senior military affairs journalist, who will be speaking in just a moment. We're here today to obtain 9/11 justice, every nation, every citizen, on behalf of the victims and family members of 9/11 terrorist attacks in every country. Europe lost 122 on 9/11 and thousands of soldiers in the 9/11 wars that followed. AE911Truth now represents nearly 3,000 architects and engineers, collectively more than 30,000 years of building and technical experience, who have signed our petition demanding a new investigation of the destruction of all 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Barbara Honegger will now address the critical relevance to Europe for the recent historic filing of the 9/11 Grand Jury Petition for a real investigation of the World Trade Center events on 9/11.
Thank you so much for everyone being here. We have a very serious reason for being here in the heart of NATO and the heart of the European Union. I am a board member of a relatively new organization called the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. We are a nonprofit 501c3 organization. We have around 35 attorneys, very dedicated attorneys, including whistleblower attorneys who have been very successful in whistleblower cases in the United States, and attorneys from all kinds of law practice. There are a number of us in the attorneys group that are professional researchers, and I am one of them. I am also I've been a senior military affairs journalist for the United States Department of Defense, as Richard noted, and therefore it's that expertise that I bring to the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. And for the last 2 years approximately, I was also on the petition, the Grand Jury Petition. That's what we're going to be talking about today. I will. The Grand Jury Petition that was just recently filed on April 10th with the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. And I'm going to be getting into more of the details of that in a moment because it is truly a historic event. The Lawyers Committee, we have one major purpose, and that is to identify the real perpetrators of the attacks of 9/11, because the 9/11 Truth movement, myself and Richard Gage and others who have been in this movement as serious forensic researchers for over a decade, we have proven that the official story of who attacked our country, the United States, is not true. And therefore, we are here in the heart of NATO to strengthen NATO, because the very first invocation, the first evoking of the Article 5 Mutual Defense Article of the NATO Treaty was based upon the official narrative of who attacked our country on 9/11. And because it is a lie, and because people around the world, there is growing awareness that it is a lie, we do not want NATO to be weakened because of it. People need to know the truth, but we need to reestablish our Atlantic Alliance based upon the facts and not upon the lie of who attacked our country. So what's on the screen now is the logo for the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, of which I'm a board member and was on the Grand Jury Petition Drafting Committee. So I'm going to briefly go over the historical context for this official filing that was on April 10th of the 9/11 Grand Jury Petition by the Lawyers Committee. And the focus is on World Trade Centers 1, 2, and 7, what really happened on 9/11 at the World Trade Center complex. We filed it with the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. And the reason for that is the federal court jurisdiction for the World Trade Center complex in Lower Manhattan. So I'm now going to briefly review the official U.S. government and NATO actions in the immediate wake of 9/11, to give the historical context for our grand jury petition filing just about a month ago. So the first and to date only invoking of Article 5, the Mutual Defense Article of the NATO Treaty, was literally a few days after the 9/11 attacks. And as I mentioned, it's based upon the official false narrative of who attacked our country. We will be getting into the proof that that narrative is false. And as you may know, almost exactly a year ago, believe it or not, the Secretary General, Mr. Stoltenberg, of the NATO, and our President, President Donald Trump, and this is a photograph, I believe it's on the screen, yes, held a inaugural ceremony of this memorial. It is officially called the 9/11 and Article 5 Memorial. It is on the grounds of the plaza at the new NATO headquarters here in Brussels, Belgium. And on this memorial is an actual piece of the steel from the World Trade Center. And Richard Gage is going to be addressing why the official story of what happened at the World Trade Center is false. Many people don't know, most people believe that almost every one of the nearly 3,000 victims of the 9/11 attacks, in the 4 separate attacks, together both in the planes and in the buildings, most people believe that all or almost all were American citizens. That is true. However, there were citizens also from all of these countries across the world, most of whom died at the World Trade Center. These are all of the non-US 9/11 victims, 372. There were 122, as Richard mentioned, European victims alone. In the United States, in the immediate wake of 9/11, as I recall, on the 14th of September, only 3 days afterwards, the United States Congress, based upon the assurance by the Bush-Cheney administration, based upon the Bush-Cheney administration's assurance that their narrative of who attacked our country on 9/11, allegedly bin Laden as a mastermind, and 19 alleged hijackers who were on the 4 alleged planes that allegedly hit the buildings or crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Based upon that narrative, only days after 9/11, the U.S. Congress was pressured into passing what is called, it's a law, which is still on the books in the United States. It's called the Authorization for the Use of Military Force. And that is an acronym, an abbreviation, AUMF. The pretext, of course, was to retaliate against those our government, our executive branch, the presidency, claimed attacked our country. There were 2,977 victims, not counting the 19 alleged hijackers, and the Authorization for Military Force also has very important clause. It says, or who harbored those who did attack the United States. And of course, that was the official narrative that was being put out by the Bush-Cheney administration only days after 9/11, immediately after, that it was the Taliban in Afghanistan that was harboring bin Laden, who in turn was the alleged mastermind of 9/11. The authorization for the use of military force must be renewed or amended by the act of Congress every 4 years, and it is actually up in the immediate future. To this day, while we're having this press conference here in Brussels, Belgium, on the 14th of May, 2018, to this very day, the authorization for the use of military force, the United States federal statute, federal law, based upon the official lie of who attacked our people on 9/11, is still the pretext, over 17 years later, for every one of the 9/11 wars. What do I mean by that? The wars that are based upon the lie of who attacked our country on 9/11. It's also the pretext for mass surveillance police state measures, not only across the United States, but also throughout the NATO nations. Just very briefly, the official 9/11 story, I just want to give you some of the burning data points of how we know it's a lie. That original story that was fed to the United States Congress within 3 days of 9/11, based upon which we are still perpetrating the 9/11 lies that are using the blood and treasure of the Nato nations, based upon a lie, was that 19 hijackers did the attacks on 4 planes. Of the 19 alleged hijackers, none were from Afghanistan, but the United States then attacked Afghanistan. It attacked Afghanistan based upon that clause in the AUMF that we can also attack a country that harbored someone who actually did the attacks, and that was allegedly Afghanistan. And that was based upon bin Laden being in Afghanistan at the time. However, I don't know if you're aware of this, but our own Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, officially has determined that bin Laden was never officially wanted for the attacks of 9/11, and the chief investigative spokesperson for the FBI stated publicly, it's on the internet, on YouTube, that the FBI did not have any hard evidence that bin Laden was involved in the 9/11 plot at all. 0 of the alleged 19 hijackers were from Iraq. The United States attacked Iraq. 15 of the alleged hijackers, even according to the official story, were from Saudi Arabia. The United States not only did not attack Saudi Arabia, but for over 14 years, until 2 years ago, approximately 2 years ago, both Democratic and Republican administrations in the United States, over a total of 16 years, kept the significant Saudi links to the conspiracy to do the 9/11-like attacks hidden and classified in the final chapter of what is called the House and Senate Joint Intelligence Committee Investigative Report of 9/11. They're known as the 28 pages, and I will briefly be getting to those in a minute. So, the one country that had the most alleged hijackers, even according to the official story, which is a lie, it's provably a lie, we did not attack their country. But we attacked the 2 countries that had no alleged hijackers, Afghanistan and Iraq. 2 of the alleged hijackers, according to the official story, were from the United Arab Emirates. The United States government took no action against the UAE. 1 of them was allegedly from Lebanon. The United States took no action against Lebanon. And even the alleged lead hijacker, Mohammed Atta, who was from Egypt, the United States government took no action against Egypt. To justify invading Afghanistan, according to the actual text of the AUMF, President Bush determined, that is the word in the text of the law, determined that bin Laden was behind 9/11 and that Afghanistan, quote, harbored, unquote, him. But as I mentioned, we now know that bin Laden was never officially even wanted by the FBI on its official website. The director of the FBI, Richard Mueller, at the time of 9/11 and after for many years, publicly stated at a press conference at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco, that videotape is on YouTube. He officially stated that there was no hard evidence linking bin Laden to the 9/11 plot. We also had 2, as you know, congressional and congressionally mandated investigations of 9/11. I've already mentioned the Joint House-Senate Intelligence Committee. Its main finding, which is also a lie, was that the 9/11 attacks could have been prevented except for the alleged failure of communication between 2 of our critical security agencies, the FBI and the CIA, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Central Intelligence Agency. This is a proven lie. It is a proven lie, and if you'd like to ask me in the Q's and A's how we know it's a lie so that I can keep this presentation shorter, I will tell you. So the Bush-Cheney administration, and then after that, for 2 entire terms of the Obama-Biden administrations, both Republican and Democratic administrations, classified and hid away and kept secret the final chapter of that Joint House and Senate Intelligence Committee investigation that we now call the 28 pages for short. Those 28 pages have absolute proof of the highest level Saudi government connections to the plot to do 9/11. However, the 9/11 Truth movement has proven that the hijackers could not have actually done the attacks. And 15 of them are allegedly from Saudi Arabia. Nevertheless, they classified and hid away the report until about 2 years ago. Then, of course, everyone knows about the 9/11 Commission. However, the 9/11 Commission report is a complete and total lie. And even the co-chairs of the commission itself have said in their book called Without Precedent, quote, "We were set up to fail." One of the commission members, the original member, Senator Max Cleland of the United States, in disgust, he went on national television and resigned from the commission and called it a total sham and a cover-up. And the commission's own chief counsel said that the Defense Department, the Pentagon, and the FAA lied to the commission. It is based upon these official lie reports of the United States government in the Bush-Cheney administration that the entire 17 years of the 9/11 wars have been rolled out. The surveillance state and all of the blood and treasure of the United States and NATO countries in these 9/11 wars. Finally, as the context to the 9/11 attorneys group's recent action, there are the kangaroo courts, which are the military commission tribunals in Guantanamo, the military base in Guantanamo, Cuba. And there's also the Moussaoui trial. You may remember that in the United States, there was the official story said there were 19 hijackers, but there were supposed to be 20, and the 20th one didn't get on the planes. The original alleged 20th hijacker was Zacarias Moussaoui, and he was arrested. He was the one person who couldn't have done the attacks of 9/11 because he was in a U.S. federal prison on 9/11. He had been arrested about 2 weeks before. In his trial, he was the one person who could not have done it. Just before 9/11, when he was in prison, they had taken his laptop. In his laptop was information that, according to the Bush-Cheney administration itself, could have prevented the attacks. However, the managers of the FBI office where he was, which was in Minnesota, as I recall, Minnesota, the FBI office in the state, asked FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. 78 times in the 2 weeks before 9/11 to please let us look in his computer, and they were denied. FBI headquarters itself, including Robert Mueller, who became FBI director 5 to 7 days before 9/11, refused looking into Moussaoui's, the so-called 20th hijacker's computer. The Guantanamo military tribunals are a complete and total sham. You may have heard of the alleged mastermind of the 9/11 attacks, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He's known in abbreviation as KSM. KSM and 4 other alleged masterminds of the attacks, conspirators, are known as the 9/11 Five, and for years they have been in prison in Guantanamo, the military base. To this day, over 17 years later, they are still only in the so-called pre-trial phase. It has never even gone to a trial. Also, a very large percentage, between 25 and 40%, of the claims, the official claims, in the 9/11 Commission report, which itself is a sham, and said to be set up to fail by its own co-chairman, is based upon the confessions, the forced confessions of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was waterboarded 183 times in 2 weeks. The judge recently asked, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, only 3 days ago, asked the judge at Guantanamo if he could personally submit information to the U.S. Senate confirmation hearing on President Trump's nominee to be CIA Director Gina Haspel, who oversaw torture prisons. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the 9/11-5 almost certainly did in fact plan, that is conspire, on a 9/11-like plot before the attacks. However, amazingly, conspiracy charges are not allowed in military tribunals. Conspiracy is not a charge you can bring in a military court. And for that reason, in early January of 2013, the judge at Guantanamo in January of 2013 ruled that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the 9/11-5, the conspiracy charges that the US government had brought against them for allegedly doing the 9/11 attacks, planning them, had to be dropped. But because the 9/11 Truth movement has proven they couldn't have actually planned the actual attacks that were done by others, because the real story of 9/11 is pre-placed explosives in both the World Trade Center towers and the Pentagon. Therefore, there really is no charge that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the 9/11-5 in Guantanamo can be brought, no reasonable charge can be brought against them, because the conspiracy charges is all they did, they conspired. So there isn't any charge that could be successfully brought against them, i.e., the real reason why we still don't have a trial. Here's an article from February of this year, February 2018, quote from the New Yorker, "Are even the judges giving up on Guantanamo?" Quote, "When it comes to the Guantanamo military commissions, no one seems to know or rather agree on anything, not even who's in charge or how the proceedings work. And there are many such articles. The Guantanamo military tribunals are a complete mess and a total sham." Now we're going to what really matters. The 9/11 Truth movement itself. Richard Gage and I are leaders of the 9/11 Truth movement. What are the legal and congressional actions that we have already done? And then we're going to end with the important actions of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. Many don't know, but Representative Cynthia McKinney, who was then represented, she was a representative in the US Congress, Democrat from the state of Georgia. She put on 2 magnificent quasi-official hearings in an official House of Representatives hearing room in Congress. And she is a national hero for having done so. For having done so, she was railroaded out of office in the next election by the Israeli lobby in the United States. Finally, after 15 years, the 28 pages were finally declassified and released. The 28 pages, again, were the final chapter in the first of the 2 official U.S. government investigations of 9/11, and that was the House Senate Joint Intelligence Committee investigation. I put investigation in quotes because it wasn't a true investigation. So the final chapter of that report, believe it or not, in September of 2016, just before the election, where Donald Trump won the election, there was a vote of the U.S. Congress, originally unanimous by both the House and the Senate, not a single vote against, to release the 28 pages. And this was over the vociferous, public, televised objection of the top spokespersons and officials for the entire national security state in both the United States, in Europe, and in Saudi Arabia. But they could not stand up against the facts that people like Richard and I have brought forward and have taken to open-minded and serious and courageous members of Congress who went to their colleagues, and the vote finally overrode Obama's veto, and the 28 pages were released. After the 28 pages were released, then within a very short period of time, an extremely important U.S. federal statute, federal law, it's now federal law, was passed, called the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act. That was in September of 2016, just before the election. It's known as JASTA, J-A-S-T-A, as I mentioned, over the public outcry of the entire international security state and over Obama's veto, the only veto of Obama ever overridden in 8 years. And that's because no one can stand up against the facts, and no one can stand up against 6,000 9/11 victims' family members and survivors. So, as soon as JASTA was passed in September of 2016, then the election happened. And in the last few months, Judge Daniels in the U.S. Federal Court for the Southern District of Manhattan, the same court, federal court, where we, the attorneys group, have just filed our grand jury petition. I'll be getting to that in a moment. The judge cited the newly passed law, the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, to, for the first time in over 17 years, to allow the 9/11 victims' family case against Saudi Arabia for allegedly facilitating the 9/11 hijackers to move forward in the U.S. courts. The tide has turned. Their discovery is going forward. And even though we in the 9/11 Truth movement can prove that the hijackers didn't really do it that day, nevertheless, if Saudi Arabia defends itself in the courtroom, all they have to do is bring even one, let alone all 6 of the alleged Saudi hijackers who allegedly died in the planes that day, who right after a day or two after 9/11 went public and said, "I'm still alive. Here I am." All they have to do is bring even one, let alone 6 of them, into the courtroom in the ultimate Perry Mason moment, and worldwide the 9/11 truth will explode. I look forward to that. I hope Saudi Arabia does do that to defend themselves. And finally, there was the 9/11, you've heard of the 9/11 Victims Compensation Fund. That was mandated by an act of Congress. Over $7 billion, almost $7 billion, has been paid out to the family members, immediate family members, to the spouses, husbands, wives, parents, or children, and I believe also even brothers and sisters of 9/11 victims, family members, either in the buildings or on the planes. But in order to receive the money, they had to agree basically to, it was like hush money. They had to agree not to sue the airlines or the security company. All but one accepted the money. Now, what have we done in the 9/11 Truth movement recently that really will make a difference? And why do we know that it will really make a difference? For not only publicly identifying the real perpetrators, but bringing them to justice. So what is the genesis of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry? It started with meetings in Rome. That's myself and Judge Ferdinando Impazamato. Is that up on the screen? Yeah. So over 2 years ago, myself and Jane Clark, there's Jane Clark, who is the president of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry when we were in Rome, and Judge Impazamato, and a very famous U.S. attorney, Daniel Sheehan, met with Judge Impazamato in Rome. And the purpose was to try to find out what Europe could do, and to have his advice as to what we could do in the United States and how we could work together to publicly identify the real perpetrators and bring them to justice, and what were the proper venues to do so. Then there was the 9/11 Justice in Focus Symposium in New York City in September of 2016. That's Richard Gage right there. And on the podium in the background is attorney Daniel Sheehan. To his right, as you're looking at the photograph, is Judge Impazamato, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Italy, and at the time, a couple of years ago, almost, Judge Impazamato was the honorary president of the Supreme Court of Italy, and he has written 2 books on 9/11 Truth. He's now deceased, unfortunately, recently, but he wrote 2 books on 9/11 that our Lawyers Committee is getting translated into English as I'm speaking to you. And in his books, he identified 9/11 as a U.S. Gladio operation. So there are also on the podium, I'm actually there, I'm off to the right, they, cut me off. That's all right, but I was on the stage. And then to the left of Danny Sheehan is a very important person in the attorneys group. That is Vic Harrison. He is the executive director, and he is also the director of litigation of the attorneys group, and he co-founded it with Jane Clark, with whom I went with attorney Daniel Sheehan to Rome to meet with Judge Imposimato. To his left, as you're looking at the photograph, is another attorney with the attorneys group, a very important person, and that is David Maischwinkel, who is an attorney in New Jersey, and I can't really see who is to the left of him. All right, so that brings us with a historical context to what we have just done. That will lead into the evidence that is in the grand jury petition that Richard will be presenting to you. So on April 10th of this year, just about a month ago, there was an historic filing of a grand jury petition in New York City to the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, to the federal courthouse in the jurisdiction of the World Trade Center at Ground Zero, by our Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. And this is a photograph from the press event, which was held on the official steps of New York City Hall, just a few blocks away, and that was on April 10th. And that's attorney and board member of the lawyers group, attorney David Maischwinkel, who is holding up the petition. You can read the petition by going to the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry website, which is www.lcfor911.org. That's lc4911.org. And you just click on read the petition and you will read what he's holding in his hand. And this is also another photograph from the steps of New York City Hall right after we filed that petition with the U.S. Attorney, with, in the middle, Bob McIlvaine, who is the father of a 9/11 World Trade Center 1 victim, his son Bobby McIlvaine. And Richard will probably be talking about one of the main actions of architects and engineers that is related to Bob McIlvaine's son. So that's Bob McIlvaine, a victim's family member who's holding up the petition on April 10th. And he's one of at least a dozen 9/11 victims' family members who signed the petition, and their electronic signatures are now with the U.S. Attorney. And this is the lead author of the grand jury petition. As one of my colleagues, I was also on the grand jury petition research and drafting committee. This is our director of litigation and executive director, Ms. Vic Harrison. This is a link to the video of the press event at New York City Hall that I showed you the two photographs from, following the filing of the grand jury petition. Now the good news is, why do we know, not just believe, but why do we know we're going to succeed? We're going to succeed because by U.S. law, by federal statute, the U.S. Attorney to whom we submitted the grand jury petition, which demands that he convene a special criminal grand jury to investigate, so that the grand jury members will then investigate what really happened at the World Trade Centers 1, 2, and 7 on 9/11. He must present our petition and our exhibits, our evidence, evidentiary exhibits. He must present them to the grand jury. He has no choice. It is non-discretionary under U.S. law. So if he doesn't do it, we will bring him to court under what's called a mandamus action, which means do your duty, and we will force him to do so. Why the grand jury? Number one, it's in the U.S. Constitution explicitly. Number two, most people don't know this, but there is a historic Supreme Court decision actually written. The decision itself was written by Judge Scalia, who at the time, he's now deceased, was the most conservative justice almost in the entire history of the U.S. Supreme Court. Judge Scalia wrote the near unanimous decision that the grand jury is the fourth people's branch of the United States federal government, co-equal with the executive branch, that is the presidency, and the courts. Now that's incredible. Excuse me, I should add the Congress. Co-equal with the United States Congress, with the executive branch, that is the presidency, and the entire court system. So it's in the Constitution, and it's the fourth people's branch of government. And we are using that branch of government to officialize the forensic facts that Richard Gage and architects and engineers have compiled over the last decade and a half. Please read and sign the petition. Go to the Lawyers Committee website, www.lc911.org. You can sign the petition electronically, and every month we will deliver the new petition signature to the U.S. Attorney. This is the executive summary of the petition, which you can also see on the website. So thank you for your attention, and I'm now going to turn it over to Richard Gage, who will present a great summary of the forensic evidence that you will find in the Grand Jury Petition on our website. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. You want to take a question while I sort this out?
Continuity of government?
What about it?
Was also part of the things that were put into place and still in
Oh,
place
yes,
today.
that's true. That's true. Yes, that's absolutely true. The question was, maybe it wasn't audible, but the question is, what is the link between 9/11 and the invocation of what's called continuity of government, COG for short, and continuity of operations, COOP. They go together, okay? And the counterterrorism czar on 9/11, Richard Clark, he's a very famous person, he personally invoked, after getting permission from Condoleezza Rice, interestingly, who was National Security Director and very close to President George W. Bush. But she gave permission to Richard Clark to officially invoke for the first time ever in the United States, continuity of government and continuity of government operations. And it is under that continuity of government operations that the entire second level deputy level of the political appointees and elected officials of the United States government were whisked away on 9/11 to a secret undisclosed location, just in case we were attacked.
And it's still active today.
It is, according to Peter Dale Scott, he believes it's still active. It's hard to know because it's classified. So I think Richard's ready.
Yeah. There's a reason why we have there's a reason why we have almost 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation. You know, most architects and engineers in America and around the world are completely unaware of the third skyscraper that collapsed on 9/11. But not these. These are the ones that took the time to find out what really happened on 9/11. These are the ones that know and question why a 47-story skyscraper collapsed on the afternoon of 9/11. Here it is here. Dwarfed, maybe, next to the tallest buildings in the world at the time, World Trade Center Twin Towers. But the tallest building in most of our states. Why are we talking about this? Because this building was not hit by an airplane. It was part of the World Trade Center complex. Here it is about a football field in length away from the North Tower. In the afternoon, in the morning, it survived the Twin Towers collapse. Both of them. There were some beams that hit it. But NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, that was tasked by Congress to explain the collapses of these towers to the American people, said this was not a significant factor in the building's collapse, nor was diesel fuel, nor was the collapse of the Twin Towers at all, other than the fires they started in this building, which we'll show you in a moment. Let's look at what happened at 5:20 in the afternoon. These penthouse collapses about 7 seconds earlier than the overall collapse. And then it comes down. We're going to spend a little bit of time with that. But first, let's listen to NIST's Sean Sunder explain the cause of this collapse, which came 7 years after 9/11 in the final report on this building.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
Primarily due to fires. These fires, which are the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of in this building. They're few, small, and scattered, as you can see. They're burning in the area of the northeast, about 2:30 or 3, but they've moved on over an hour before this building's collapse. Now, no skyscraper has ever collapsed due to fire before 9/11. Not in Los Angeles, which burned 3.5 hours, this building, over 5 floors, nor in Philadelphia, 18 hours over 8 floors, nor in Caracas, Venezuela, 17 hours over 26 floors. Now let's look at what can bring buildings down and what has brought hundreds of skyscrapers, or not skyscrapers, but mid-rise office buildings, some skyscrapers down. It's called controlled demolition. We place thousands or hundreds of pre-placed cutter charges near the columns and beams in the building and set them off in a very precise order, beginning with the bottom, usually, but not always, and then synchronistically timed floor by floor. Well, there's only half a dozen companies in the US that can actually accomplish this. Fire certainly does not. Let's look at some of the key characteristic features of controlled demolition and see if Building 7 has any of them. Is there a sudden onset of destruction, for instance, at the base of the structure? Let's listen to Dan Rather on CBS.
What you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Now we're going to videotape the collapse of this building. It's amazing. Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before. A building was deliberately destroyed by low-priced dynamite to knock it down.
Whoa, those are pretty harsh words. Dan is using his intuition here. We should all be using our intuition, but we haven't heard Dan talk about this collapse after 9/11, nor have we seen it on the mainstream media, nor has the American Institute of Architects and the American Society of Civil Engineers presented this, the third worst structural failure in modern history, to their association members. Well, number 2, is there a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint? Let's take a look from West Street. Pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. Look closer. You'll see the main penthouse and screen wall in the center of the building at the top drop just half a second prior to the overall building. This indicates complete core column damage symmetrically underneath this roof structure, which completely pulls the rug out from the NIST theory, which says that this collapse started on one side of the building and spread to the other side of the building in just 10 or 15 seconds. And yes, it falls mostly into its own footprint. I'm not quite convinced yet. Let's see. Put them side by side. Building 7 on the left, the known controlled demolition on the right. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since the official cause of this building's collapse, fire, has never brought down a skyscraper before 9/11. Should it not have been the first hypothesis seriously considered, rather than having been relegated to a year later to be answered in frequently asked questions, which NIST got thousands of prior to that issuance of that FAQ. Number 3, is there a patterned removal of column supports? Well, how do you bring a building down symmetrically? You have to remove all 82 columns within a fraction of a second of each other. If you have any divergence from this pattern, the building will begin to fall over to the path of least resistance, to its wounded part, while the others remain. Does fire have this precision capability? Not these fires. Is there a free fall acceleration straight down through the path of the greatest resistance? Well, David Chandler, a physics teacher, identifies it very clearly. We have, it fits the free fall data quite clearly, the curve on the lower part here. You can see the building gaining downward distance with every second. That's the definition of acceleration. We have, it's as if 8 stories were removed from this building all at once, enabling it to fall as fast as a bowling ball falling from the sky. Number 5, is there a total dismemberment of the structural steel frame? Yeah, a 47-story skyscraper is collapsing, moment-resisting steel frame structure, collapsing as if all of its columns and beams connections failing all at once almost. It should have been a natural collapse, like you see here. These buildings collapsed naturally due to earthquake in these cases. It should have fallen over to the path of least resistance, as these do. As you can see here, these columns and beams are not severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. Number 7, are there sounds of explosions heard by witnesses? Flashes of light seen by them? Well, what does Sean Sunder say about explosives? He says, we found no evidence. Later he acknowledges in writing that he never looked for it. You can't find what you're not looking for, but here are the witnesses. Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic.
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds. You heard explosions. Like, boom! And it's like a distinct sound. It's not like when the compression, like boom, 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 boom. Like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was a boom! And like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
And Barry Jennings, who along with Mayor Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess, was stuck in the building because it had been evacuated prior to the planes hitting the towers, but before the towers came down.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell in. When we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor, I heard some more explosions. It also the sound. Like a boom. Like an explosion.
More than one.
Yes.
We started walking down the stairs, we went to the 8th floor. Big explosion. So we went back into the 8th floor.
When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
Bombs? Bombs in the building like these? Bombs heard in the late morning of 9/11?
Yeah, here's one of the guys, he can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, no. You want to call your mother?
But none of these bombs or witnesses of explosions are part of the official story of this building's collapse. None of them. 0. What do the structural engineers say? Well, here's one of 100 signed on to our petition demanding a new investigation. A localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. What about foreknowledge? We'd expect to know, or some people to know, about the imminent collapse of a building if it's going to be a controlled demolition. Let's listen to these mysterious construction workers walking away from Building 7, hearing an explosion, looking back over their shoulder at the building, and then looking straight into the CNN camera and saying this. The building is about to blow up. Flame and debris coming down. How do they know that? And what did Kevin McPadden say prior to that witness of explosions that he heard? He and others are held back 6 blocks away from Building 7 because they were told it's going to come down. Even though skyscraper on fire has never come down due to fire. So he's listening to radio held in the hand of a Red Cross worker, and he hears this.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
Do buildings come down to countdowns with fires? The BBC announced the collapse of this building 20 minutes before it even happened. This is extraordinary reporting. They apologize for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day. What's going on here? Do we have the 10 key characteristic features of controlled demolition? Is this direct evidence of destruction with explosives? Can fire create any one of these features, let alone all of them? Is there additional circumstantial corroborative evidence? We believe that that's the case. And yes, proof of controlled demolition has prompted more than 2,900 architects and engineers to sign on to the petition demanding a new investigation, to the point where we have collectively engaged the University of Alaska in a $300,000 3-year study of what really happened at the World Trade Center. How World Trade Center 7 could not have been brought down, as NIST claims, by fire. That's already their preliminary conclusion. The final report is due this summer. They're now modeling progressive collapse, what could have actually brought it down. And so they've engaged, they're doing the job that NIST assigned, that Congress assigned NIST to do, but which NIST had failed miserably. So they're undergoing this effort now and using the worst case parameters that NIST claims to be the cause to show that there's no way, even with everything in favor, according to NIST, it could not have come down. So we're anxiously awaiting this final report on this model. What about the World Trade Center towers? Do they exhibit any of the features of controlled demolition? Is there a sudden onset of destruction at the North Tower? From rest to movement suddenly, without delay. How about the South Tower? From rest to movement suddenly, no jolting, no hesitation, no impact, no waiting, no hesitation. Number 2, is there a pattern set of explosions that are heard by witnesses? Flashes of light that are seen by them? Well, we turn to the oral histories of the first responders, which document 118 firefighters observing flashes, sounds. Let's look at a couple of them. We felt the ground shake. You could see the tower sway, and then it just came down. You're going to hear this order of events through all of these witnesses, or most all of them, that they're feeling the phenomena, experiencing the phenomena, seeing the phenomena, all before the collapse of the towers. This is critical. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. Felt like a train running under my feet. The next thing we know, we look up and the tower is collapsing. Shook my bones shortly before the first tower came down. I remember feeling the ground shaking. Heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. North Tower on the right, a known controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition. Especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never, before 9/11, brought down a skyscraper or on 9/11. Inside joke. You ever see a professional demolition where they set the charges on certain floors and then you hear pop, pop, pop? When I heard that friggin' noise, that's when I saw the building coming down. South Tower on the right, a known controlled demolition on the left. Any similarity? Enough to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive.
You started floor by floor, started. Was it if they had detonated? Yeah, detonated. All the way down.
Are these credible witnesses? This says the upper part of the North Tower in particular above the point of jet plane impacts. The 15-story section drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. Is that possible? Physics says it's not, but the video confirms that it's not. What we see is the upper part of the tower destroying itself before it ever drives anything down to the ground or any part of it. In fact, in none of the photos or videos do we see an upper portion of this building driving the rest of the building down. What we see is upward, outward, arching streamers, freely flying structural steel sections trailed by thick white smoke clouds, a geometry of fireworks. Looks more like the eruption in the Tongan Sea in 2009. Feature number 3, is there a straight down symmetrical collapse or progression outside the footprint? Well, this is a 207-foot wide building. The debris is thrown 12 to 1,400 feet in every direction. And yes, it's symmetrical. From below, we see all the sides of the 2 out of the 4 sides of the building. The other 2 are doing the same thing, traveling uniformly and in acceleration straight down through the path of greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structural steel and the perimeter of this building, and hurled 600 feet to the winter gardens, in this case, across the street, destroying them well beyond the perimeter of the structure of the Twin Towers. And what we see is a nice, neat pile on the right, Building 7, a classic implosion versus the extremely explosive event of the Twin Towers. Let's look at those ejections occurring at all floors at once above the point of jet plane impact in the South Tower. Again and again and again as we play this, you see dozens of squibs or isolated explosive ejections. You see them occurring 20, 40, 60 stories down below the zone of destruction. This says, well, these are puffs of air. Well, they're not puffs of air. You can see the solids in the squibs. This says, oh, well, this is occurring as a result of that pile driver pushing down, creating air pressure in the elevator. It's got to come out somewhere, right? No. If this pile driver is there, which it's not, as we saw, it's destroyed itself in the first 4 seconds, then it would have, if it were there, it would have created uniform air pressure around the interior space here, which was open. The whole point of the structural system in the World Trade Center was to group the columns around the elevator shafts on the inside and move the rest of them to the outside, creating a 60-foot open, 20 meters open. So it would have blown out all the windows if it blew out any of them, not these highly focalized, pinpoint accurate, violent ejections that we see here. And what about the speed of this building's collapse, number 5? How fast is it coming down? Well, let's begin. Oops. Let's just see. On the right, 10 floors per second. The whole building comes down in about 15 seconds. And the video on the left is falling behind. Seriously. But it comes down in about 15 seconds. What does that mean? What's it coming through? It's coming through all this steel. There's more steel than glass in the facade of this building. It's as if it's not even there somehow. Something's shattering. Let's look at feature number 6. The total shattering of the steel frame. It's shattered all the way down to these few remaining shards. NFPA, National Fire Protection Association Guide 921, says look for high order damage characterized by the shattering of the structure. Is that what we see? We see it everywhere. Broken into 37.5-foot lengths, these core columns. What about feature number 7? What's happening to these structural steel sections? Are they being laterally ejected? Yes, 350 feet to 600 feet, 200 meters in every direction outside the perimeter of this building. Whoa, what's this? Back to, forward to, back to, forward to. Freely flying structural steel sections weighing 4 tons laterally ejected. How does a gravitational progressive collapse work? Down. What's happening here? Where's the force coming from to hurl this laterally 300 to 400 feet in that case? It's enough force to hurl a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. Where's the force necessary to disappear the floors? We don't see 110 floors stacked up at the bottom. We don't see 50. We don't see 1. Where are the floors? We see a pile of twisted steel, core and perimeter columns. On the right, we have a gravitational collapse in Mexico. We can see the pancakes. We're looking for the pancakes here. Where are they? Let's look for that pulverized concrete, because they're not down at the bottom. Oh, there's the concrete. Pulverized in midair to a fine powder. All the photos, all the videos show these incredible clouds of concrete and gypsum board. 100 micron particles of concrete covering lower Manhattan in a 3 square mile area. 4 inches thick. What do the experts say about all this? One of 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition in AE911Truth. Prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the twin towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself, crushing all 287 massive columns on each floor while maintaining a near free-fall acceleration. As if the 80,000 tons of supporting structural steel underneath didn't even exist. David Scott. Near free-fall collapse violates laws of physics. Doesn't look anything like a heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism. Why did the complete collapse of the Twin Towers become inevitable? Why would all 110 stories drop straight down to the ground in 10 seconds, pulverizing the contents to dust and twisted steel? All 3 collapses were very uniform in nature, says Scott Granger, fire protection engineer. Natural collapses, due to unplanned events, are not uniform. Fires are very weak, says Ed Mooniak, fire protection engineer. NIST reports and they confirm that the steel temperatures were low. WTC collapses have no resemblance to any previous high-rise fire. What about the persistent heat? What's going on here where the NASA overflights identify temperatures exceeding 1160 degrees, 612 Celsius on the surface of the pile? Well, guess what? There's no fire on the surface of the pile. What are they measuring? They're measuring the radiating heat that makes it to the surface from something much hotter deep down in the pile that they were pulling up by the ton, as you see in the material dripping from the crab claw excavators here. Liquid metal falling. Red hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile, says David Scott of Air Associates. Dripping from the molten steel, says this firefighter. Saw pools of literally molten steel, says the president of the cleanup company. Seeing the molten steel, uncovering red hot metal beams, ranging from molten metal which was still red hot weeks after the event. Molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains.
You get down below and you see molten steel running down the channel wells. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like lava.
Volcano.
Streams of molten metal that leaked from the hot cores and flowed down. Are these credible witnesses? Why are none of their reports of this molten metal included in the final report issued by NIST? And none of the witnesses of explosions that we heard from also. Not one. The end of the beam would be dripping from molten steel. A river of steel flowing, says who? The structural engineer of the World Trade Center himself, Leslie Robertson. It's dripping out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. This is not lead, it's not copper, it's not aluminum. This is molten iron or steel. We can tell by the physics of it. Because of its color, we know its temperature. It's exceeding 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, 1,200 degrees, I think, Celsius here. Steel members in the debris cloud that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. According to the New York Times, Abulhassan Astani-Asl says, I saw a melting of girders in the World Trade Center. He doesn't know where it comes from. And FEMA doesn't know where this phenomenon came from but they put it in their limited metallurgical examination, Appendix C, in the Building Performance Assessment Report that came out in May of 2002 on the destruction of the World Trade Center. Never before observed, they say, eutectic reactions, intergranular melting, solid steel girders into Swiss cheese. Guess what? Fires don't do this. What does? Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, intergranular melting, liquid iron, that's molten iron. We're not talking about even molten steel here. Iron's a component of steel, but this is elemental iron. Where does that come from? We haven't used iron in steel structures for 100 years or so. Hot corrosion attack on the steel with sulfur. Where does the sulfur come from? Perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, says FEMA. Yet this information was completely ignored when NIST took over the investigation and threw out this detailed metallurgical examination of the steel, which documents half-inch thickness of steel beams thinned to almost razor sharpness. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, intergranular melting. Fire doesn't, jet fuel doesn't burn even 600 degrees Fahrenheit, 300 degrees Celsius. According to the manufacturer of jet fuel themselves. Some say the fires are 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, 650 Celsius. Some, NIST claims 1,800 degrees. But structural steel doesn't melt to almost twice these temperatures. What's causing it to melt? We're going to look at thermite, a possible source of this heat. Because steel had definitely melted. We can tell, again, by the color, the temperature, which exceeding 1,371 Celsius, 2,500. That's the physics of molten materials like this. You can tell how hot it is by its color. So, forensic evidence. Is there thermite in the evidence of the World Trade Center aftermath? Well, what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of fire, and iron oxide melts.
We have a possible source for the sulfur, which is added to thermite to become thermate. We have a possible source for the extreme heat, because it produces 4,000 degree temperatures here with the liquid molten thermite. Well, the National Fire Protection Association Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation says look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite or other pyrotechnic materials. When this says they found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used, later they acknowledged in writing that they never looked for it. But others did. In fact, Stephen Jones is one of them. He did some detailed, exhaustive research on the sculptures from the World Trade Center which you can see in our additional materials. We don't have time to go into it in this press conference. But he suggests that if thermite was used, you'd have a characteristic burn pattern, a white, yellow, hot liquid metal, like you see here pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. And you'd have whitish cloud of aluminum oxide ash, which can be seen arising out of the top of this molten material, and can be seen trailing these freely flying structural steel sections back to, forward to. Guess what? Steel is not combustible in fires, normal fires, like this is said to be. What is burning on the ends of these steel beams? What caused these steel columns to be endowed with thick slag pouring off the top of these 45-degree cuts, which are seen all over the steel? What was found in the fine powder ubiquitous on 9/11? The U.S. Geological Survey does a detailed particle atlas of the World Trade Center dust. In it, they find billions of what? Previously molten iron microspheres. Up to 10 tons of this material that are formed during the event, according to Environmental Engineering Association firm R.J. Lee, who's known around the country, in the U.S. So this is up to 6% of the dust samples are these unknown origin, previously molten iron microspheres. 150 times the background value of iron. And by the way, it's formed during the event, so it's not coming from the welders at the site. How is thermite actually made? I mean, how does it work? Right here in a small, limited, controlled experiment, you see thousands of sparks. Well, those are liquid molten iron microspheres that cool and fall with all of the dust everywhere. What else was found, though? We have a small team of scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen, analyzing 7 samples, like the sample collected from this apartment of Jeanette McKinley across the street from the South Tower. They find the same curious red-gray chips in all of the samples. Red on one side, gray on the other. They come up to a magnet. They get really curious. So they zoom. They do an X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy of the red side, and what do they find? The ingredients of thermite in all of these chips that they collect. Aluminum, iron oxide particularly, aluminum powder, silica, oxygen, carbon. Whoa, they get real curious. Zoom in with an electron microscope 50,000 times. What do they find? Nanoparticles of iron oxide and aluminum powder, the ingredients of thermite, 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. They heat them up in a differential scanning calorimeter. And what happens in the actual published data from companies that make this stuff? At about 420 degrees centigrade, it ignites. Well, that's exactly what happens to all the samples, proving that it's an energetic material. So what happens when it ignites? It produces the iron microspheres with the same chemical signature of all the other spheres that are found at the World Trade Center. Almost identical signature. Identical enough, as if we didn't know where those previously molten iron microspheres came from, because they're found attached to these partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here. So you see, this is an internally consistent, self-corroborating set of repeatable data that can be used in a court of law or by a grand jury, such as the grand jury that we've petitioned for investigation in the U.S. Southern District. You see, this has been worked on before by Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, Los Alamos Lab, and other firms, defense contracting firms like SAIC. When you reduce the size of these particles to nanoparticles, the surface area increases exponentially. So the chemical reaction is virtually instantaneous. It becomes more explosive. You start with an incendiary, it's engineered to become more explosive. Now, it's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. Very sophisticated process, made only in the most sophisticated, advanced defense contracting laboratories. So they determined, hey, the red layer of the red-gray chips we've discovered is in the dust is active, unreacted thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology, highly energetic, pyrotechnic, or explosive material. Well, maybe the steel was preserved so that others could get their hands on it, do a proper investigation. No, in what was easily the largest and most perplexing set of structural failures in history, the steel was removed from the site starting 2 weeks after 9/11, up to 400 truckloads a day. This is the destruction of evidence in a crime scene, because it was sent to China for recycling. Yes, before investigators could do a proper investigation, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out crucial evidence that can answer many questions. Is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. And that's why we continue to show that we have all 10 key characteristic features and some very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition. This is direct evidence of explosive destruction. Fire doesn't create any of these features, let alone all of them, with additional circumstantial and corroborative testimony, witness testimony, video reports. This is proof of controlled demolition, which is why we have 2,900 architects and engineers for 911Truth demanding a new investigation, which is why we have one of the most serious problems in our country's history. But I'd like to give Barbara an opportunity to make some closing comments, and I'll come right back. Slides?
Thank you.
Yes.
Uh-oh.
Okay. We're up. Okay, thank you, Richard. So, what you have just heard is evidence that architects and engineers and others who have inputted into architects and engineers for 9/11Truth over the past 12, 15, 14 years? 12 years have pulled together and compiled. And what we in the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry have done is to pull all of that together into one legal framework with all of the evidence present, and each of the points in the petition has a link, a hyperlink to the actual evidentiary exhibit. This is all on the website, Lawyers Committee, or LC4911.org. So there is all of that evidence that has been put in an official framework and presented to the U.S. Attorney. So what are we doing in the Lawyers Committee? It's one of the many ways that we are in the process of officializing the facts. So why does this matter? It matters because if you think of a balance, you know, the balance of justice, the scales of justice. On the one side, for over 17 years now, we have had a massive lie about who attacked our country on 9/11. It's the official lie, but it's a lie plus an official frame. So we're taking the facts, the truth, and we're adding the official frame, the legal frame. Now, because official truth then starts getting, two claims of official truth start getting weighed against each other, and it's a zero-sum game. And because we are building the facts in the official frame, the lie in the official frame cannot compete. And we will eventually win. It's only a matter of time. So the scales of justice have turned. The scales of justice also turned, the tables of justice also turned in an historic an unprecedented way when the United States Congress passed the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, JASTA. And that was in September of 2016. JASTA has been called a revolution in the foundation of international law. And myself and Vic Harrison, Attorney Vic Harrison, and Jane Clark, the President, Vice President, Executive Director, and Litigation Director of the Attorneys Group, were personally at the core of the strategy for getting the 28 pages of the House Senate Intelligence Committee investigation of 9/11 released, which immediately led, in a very short period of time, to the passage of JASTA. Why is JASTA a revolution in the foundation of international law? Because until JASTA, not a single sovereign nation could have its legal sovereignty pierced, is the word they use in the law, under international law. That the foundation of the entire old world order was immunity of sovereign governments, which is based upon the idea of the absolute immunity of the king. The monarch could do anything he or she wanted, and there was nothing you could do to the monarch. So those who want there to be too much power in the executive branches and not enough in the Congress, and especially hardly any in the judicial branches. Because the judicial branches, when you go into a court of law or into a grand jury, you have to have facts, and you have to have the evidence for those facts. Power is based on lies. The more lies they can get by with, the more power they have. And the more power they project, and the more lies they get by with. And it's a vicious circle. But if you increase the strength of the court system, which is based upon evidentiary facts, then that is at the expense of the executive, which is the power-based branch of government. So that's what we're doing. And we're basing that upon the Constitution of the United States, which guarantees federal grand juries, and a U.S. Supreme Court decision, which states that the grand juries, federal grand juries of the United States, are the fourth people's branch of government, co-equal with the Congress of the United States, the presidency, the entire executive branch, and the whole court system, including the Supreme Court itself. And this was a Supreme Court decision. That's an extremely powerful branch of our government, and we are going to take it back, and we are going to use it for 9/11 Truth. I also wanted to mention, Richard didn't happen to mention this, but it's featured in the Grand Jury Petition. And this was one of my major contributions to the Grand Jury Petition. And that is that one of the most important facts in my mind, and this is heavily documented in both witness testimonies by video and also forensic seismic evidence and a seismic analysis in the Grand Jury Petition, there were pre-plane impact explosions in the deep basements of both World Trade Center towers before the plane impacts. And in many controlled demolitions, you need to take out the fundamental deep structure of the building. So the controlled demolition sequence of both World Trade Center towers happened before the plane impacted either tower. That's an incredibly important fact, which I consider co-equal to the importance of World Trade Center 7, coming down in a classic controlled demolition, even though not hit by a plane. Those two facts together are the burning data points that standing alone, each one standing alone, proves the official story at the World Trade Center cannot possibly physically be true. I want to just remind people that we are here in Brussels, Belgium, which is the headquarters of NATO as well as the European Union. And again, what you're looking at here on the screen is an official memorial that is attempting literally to cast in stone the official lie of 9/11. But the paradox and irony of this is that on that memorial, which was dedicated by the Secretary General of NATO and President Trump almost exactly a year ago today, is a piece of steel from the World Trade Center towers that was not shipped to China. There are quite a few pieces of steel from the World Trade Center that have been sent all around the world, and there are so-called 9/11 memorials to the lie of 9/11 so far, all over the world, including in Israel, by the way, and across Europe. Now, the paradox and irony is that this piece of steel, we know from other pieces of steel from the World Trade Center that it had scrapings, and those have been analyzed, that there is evidence of the nanothermite on that piece of steel. So that very piece of steel, wouldn't it be great if we could get in there, slip in there, and get a scraping, give it to Professor Stephen Jones, which he's already done, an analysis of a scraping from other pieces of the steel that he's been able to obtain. And I'm almost certain that we would show presence of nanothermite also on a scraping from this monument. So perhaps the most important thing that someone from Belgium can do is to go to that piece of steel and walk by and get a scraping.
What is the name of the monument? Do you know
Well, it's I don't know the precise name, but it's the 9/11, according to the speech by Secretary General Stoltenberg on May 27th of last year, with just before President Trump spoke. He called it the 9/11 and Article 5 Memorial. Article 5, again, being the critical article of the entire NATO treaty, which is the essence of the treaty, which is the mutual defense article. Okay.
Amazing.
It is quite amazing. Now, I just want to mention fertile areas for future action and projects of the attorneys group, the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. The World Trade Center 1, 2, and 7 Grand Jury Petition that we filed on April 10th is only the beginning. It's only the beginning. We already have plans to move forward with other areas of petition research, drafting, and filings with the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District, including other 9/11 attacks, including the Pentagon, including Pentagon WC parallels, Shanksville, the anthrax letter attacks, official government misconduct and foreknowledge, hijackers and hijackings, the 9/11 scenario military exercises and NORAD non-response, and we have a committee on FOI submissions and litigations. Well, why are FOIA submissions important? One of the major functions and projects of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, and everything we do, by the way, is volunteer. Everything we do is volunteer. One of the most important projects we have is we submit Freedom of Information Act requests. They're called FOIA requests under federal law in the United States. Any citizen of the United States under FOIA law, with certain exceptions for national security, can ask for any document in the files of any agency of the U.S. federal government. You have to identify as well as you can what you think the documents are, and you ask for them. And the law gives the agency, it could be the CIA, the FBI, the National Security Agency, doesn't matter, the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, it doesn't matter. They all have FOIA officers and offices, and they are required to look for what you ask for. And they're required to give it to you only for the price of copying or putting the information on a digital thumb drive or hard drive and getting it to you. So it's affordable, unless there are not very many exceptions to that law, and they can decline it for certain reasons like national security or privacy rights, right? And they often invoke privacy rights unnecessarily just to cover things up. But the law makes it clear you can appeal, and the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry has appealed many of our FOIA requests for documents we know the government still has about 9/11 that we need to go to court and to go to the grand jury with. So we are filing many FOIA submissions, and then we appeal, and all of that is volunteer lawyers' time, pro bono time. And then if we are still denied the appeal, then we go to court. It's called an FOIA lawsuit, and we are in the process of a number of FOIA lawsuits for critical pieces of evidence. One of the major projects in front of us for investigation and possible other petition amendments to the one we already have are the parallels between the World Trade Center and the Pentagon attacks, and in particular the evidence showing that the real story at both the World Trade Center, Towers 1, 2, and 7, and the Pentagon are not the planes, which were just the cover story, for the public to believe they were the planes and the fires therefrom were the reason for the collapses of the towers. The same thing is true at the Pentagon, that the real story at the Pentagon is pre-placed explosives. I'm just going to give you one data point to prove that to you. Believe it or not, and this is a quote in Time magazine, the cover story, there's the cover, with then director of the FBI, he was director on 9/11 and after, Robert Mueller. He is now the special counsel investigating the alleged collusion behind President Trump's campaign in 2016 and the Russians. This is then FBI Director Mueller, cover of Time magazine, quote, on 9/11, the FBI's Strategic Intelligence Operations Center filled to capacity and remained that way through Pent-Bomb. This is his own quote. Pent-Bomb is the FBI's cryptonym or abbreviation for Pentagon, Twin Towers, and bombing. That's the official name to this day, the official acronym, and it stands for bombs. And this is for anyone who's interested in knowing the facts about why the real story at the Pentagon is the same as at the World Trade Center. The real story is pre-placed inside explosives. This is my Behind the Smoke curtain, which is on YouTube and has over 500,000 views. What can Europeans do? First and foremost, please support the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 inquiry. Every bit of time of our 35 to 40 attorneys, most in the US, but also in Canada and some in Europe, is volunteer. It's pro bono time. However, we do have to pay fees. We have to pay FOIA filing fees and other court fees once we go to court, and we know we will have to go to court. If the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York either says no officially in writing to us after maybe 3 months, another 2 months from now, or says nothing, we have to go to court and file a mandamus action in a higher court, and that will cost money. So we need your help. And you can donate at the Lawyers Committee website, lc4911.org. I also want to just emphasize that in my own life, from personal experience, having been involved as a whistleblower, as well as a researcher on 9/11, my work on the deep story behind the Iran side of Iran-Contra resulted in my book called October Surprise, published in May of 1989. And that book led to a full subpoena power U.S. House of Representatives reinvestigation of the Iran side of the Iran-Contra scandal. So I know from personal experience what it takes to achieve what Architects and Engineers is trying to do, which is independent of our grand jury project. Architects and Engineers is working towards a new congressional investigation of 9/11 as well, all right? But from my own personal experience, having been successful in this for the Iran side of Iran-Contra, getting an entirely new congressional investigation on it after the Iran-Contra hearings were already over and that report was published, I can tell you that from personal experience, you achieve the goal that you're trying to achieve with a kind of vice or pincer effect. You have to have the grassroots action from the bottom, but you have to have critical people on the inside of the official structure from the top. And when you reach a critical mass going both ways, you achieve victory. That's what happened with the release of the 28 pages and with the passage of the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act. That's what we had. You also here in Europe need to do everything you can to educate everyone you know personally, your family members, your colleagues at work, and the public in general. You can do this by flyering. What you have on the screen is a picture of the official 2 beams that are put up on and around the September 11th anniversary in New York City every year. The 2 of those beams are supposed to represent World Trade Centers 1 and 2 and the victims therefrom of the attacks of 9/11. But Richard Gage and I personally put up the 3rd beam in New York City on the 9th anniversary of 9/11. And that's an example of something that individual citizens can do, and you are looking at 2 of them who achieved that. And it's now the icon, or one of the icons, not only of Architects and Engineers, but of the worldwide 9/11 Truth movement. You can join the global 9/11 Truth Action Project. which is known as TAP. And this is their website, www.9. I guess there's no slash in it, is there, Richard? I don't think you can have a slash. So it's www.911 without the slash, tap.org. All right? And finally, we're here because we need, and I know Richard will address this at his close as well, but we're here because we need Europe to come to the defense of the United States. And you do that by coming to the defense of the truth about what happened on 9/11. We need to refound our Atlantic Alliance, Nato, on the truth and not upon the lies of what happened on 9/11. Without truth, there can be no justice, and without justice, there can be no peace. Thank you.
Thank you.
Here in Brussels, near the headquarters of NATO and the EU, we, on behalf of the 9/11 Truth movement worldwide, are calling all of Europe to come to the aid of the United States of America. Yet again, in the spirit of Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, this time based on truth, not upon lies. Only the truth about 9/11 has the real potential to end the 9/11 wars, which continue to drain the blood and treasure of every NATO nation. Thus, only the truth about 9/11 can restore peace to the world. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.